Welcome to today's presentation. You've also had a really busy year overseas studying glyphosate. Very topical, very relevant to today's farming. We look forward with interest to what you've got to tell us about it. So let's start the sort of presentation by your first question. Why did you decide to study this issue?
Well, thank you, Mary, and welcome to everyone that's joining in. My Nuffield journey, Mary, essentially began following an interview I heard on national radio between Jacqueline Rowath in her capacity as the Chief Scientist for the EPA and Catherine Ryan. The interview was around the EPA's stance on glyphosate and their insistence that if it was used as per the label instructions that it was deemed to be a safe product. Catherine Ryan was armed with data and literature, and she felt that glyphosate was being found throughout the food chain, including water and in breast milk, and that it was indeed carcinogenic. Regardless of what Professor Rowath answered or what evidence she used, the direction of the interview never really changed, and that was her opinion that glyphosate should be removed from use. Mary, before I probably go any further, I should declare that I'm an arable farmer and a glyphosate user as standard practice, and I believed that it was one of the safest products on earth. We were told that it was extremely low toxicity. Its use in agriculture is considered best practice and has been for many, many years.
So why was this an important topic for you and for agriculture? Why is it important?
Great question, Mary. There are two reasons for me why it's an important topic, and it became obvious after reflecting on that initial interview. Regardless of what I think and what I thought, the interviewer, Catherine Ryan, was asking questions on behalf of my customer. What if she's right? What if glyphosate is as bad as what she was saying? Shouldn't we as farmers know that? And the other reason, and I alluded to it before, was that glyphosate is an integral part of most farming systems. We don't even think about it. So to remove that option, I think, would cause huge upheaval and a complete change in farming operations. And so, I wanted to understand how that would look.
So, Hamish, I instantly understand what you're saying. My family are farming, but you spent 22 weeks away overseas. Can you tell us what the issues are with glyphosate?
Yeah, well, it's a huge question, Mary, and I'll try and cover it in the short amount of time that we've got. I spent 6 weeks in the USA. I visited both coasts, and I spent a lot of time in the Midwest. I also went to Asia and to Europe. I concluded that it is such a complicated story that as I said, it's very hard to tackle in a short time, and there are many realizations and conclusions. I think that glyphosate is really a victim of its own success in many ways, and there is absolutely no doubt that the issues have their roots in the USA and its association with GMO crops. Really briefly, in a nutshell, science took the main commodity crops, corn, soy, lucerne, cotton, and canola, and made them resistant to glyphosate, a chemical that has very low toxicity, breaks down rapidly when in contact with soil, and targets an enzyme found in plants only as its main mode of action. So in producing Roundup-ready crops, the seed companies effectively substituted what was considered harsh chemistry at the time, atrazine and 2,4-D, as an example, with this very benign product. And it should have been a win-win for farmers and consumers. What actually happened was that the amount of glyphosate that is being used now in countries with Roundup-ready crops has increased by a factor of 15, and people are alarmed by this. The general public see huge multinational companies making huge profits. People have realised that farmers are spraying crops and that they're drenching animals that perhaps they were oblivious to before. In those GMO countries, food is labelled as either GMO-free or has no label, and so the inference there is that if it hasn't got a label about GMO, it must be GMO, and therefore it must contain glyphosate. To quote several farmers I talked to in the Midwest, Roundup-ready and BT crops have made farming so easy, and it has got very, very intensive compared to days gone by. Almost industrial, I would say. What GMO and certainly glyphosate has allowed for is specialisation away from the mixed model of days gone by. This is what we hear about in New Zealand when people talk of monocultures and depleted soils and environmental degradation. Throughout the US and Europe, I saw skeletons of farms past, of fences, of barns, of cattle and sheep yards that haven't been used for years, where once the farming model was of mixed crop and animals is now not the normal at all. So Mary, that's in a nutshell the farm story, but I needed to find out about the consumer and the health side of the issues. Over my year away, I conducted countless casual interviews with people and found out that, people generally trust farmers, but they don't understand what farmers do. I visited with toxicologists and medical people, and all of which basically said the same things, that there is that much glyphosate used today, there is no real hiding from it in food, and that the science conducted in the 1970s hasn't changed, but the accuracy of the testing has improved out of sight. That there are glyphosate residues found in most commodity food crops in the USA today. Currently, there is no scientific proof of medical issues, but there are a multitude of correlations, including links to celiac disease, gluten intolerance. And while there is no evidence to directly link glyphosate to these, we all know people who are affected. I have a wife and daughter who are both wheat intolerant. There is conflict between the UN International Agency for Cancer Research, who in 2015 claimed a probable link with cancer, and yet only a year later the EU Chemical Agency, similar to our EPA, found no grounds to classify the controversial herbicide as carcinogenic at all. The toxicologists I spoke with believe that it is not the product that is the problem, but the cumulative dose that is the issue. There is certainly a school of thought that glyphosate can mimic the female growth hormones in mammals at high dosages. So these warnings and correlations and findings have led to restrictions in Germany and France, and there will be an outright ban in those two countries in 2022. So I guess, Mary, to summarise those two things, the real issue in all of this is that farmers are really caught in the middle of a dilemma between two branches of science. Agricultural science, who see no problem with glyphosate usage as long as it's used appropriately, and medical science, who warn of health issues with potential glyphosate association. It's now commonplace, and farmers through absolutely no fault of their own and that are complying with best practice are caught right in the middle of that dilemma.
So, Hamish, a great summary, and I'm sure there's a lot more that you can say about the subject, and certainly you've written very comprehensively in your report. But can you talk to us a little bit about farming without glyphosate? Is it possible?
Yeah, okay, that's great, Mary. If it's okay with you, I'll give you an example of what I see as the negative side of that question, and then the positive side. I guess from the outset, I should say that farming is certainly possible without glyphosate because it was done before and it's being done now. However, as I said in my opening, there's always trade-offs. I've looked at conventional farming, organics, regenerative agriculture, intensive feedlots, cropping systems, third world farming, small-scale horticulture, and everything in between. To farm without glyphosate for those that depend on it, and remember, it is the world's most widely used agrochemical, will be huge. The majority of the R&D organisations involved in agriculture and the universities that I visited just all basically said to me that it can't be done. Agriculture has come too far. There's 3 generations of farmers that don't know any different. There's so much to report on. I guess I discovered 2 things that stick in my mind on the negative side. And the first is an organic farm in a country outside of New Zealand. This farm, it was an integrated system of dairy, sheep and crops and vegetables, but it had a problem with 2 weeds, docks and cooch, and we have both of those things in New Zealand. They bought machines that invested in people to do hand weeding, but they simply could not get on top of these 2 problem weeds. Their solution has been to deregister the problem areas from organic accreditation, clean them up with glyphosate, and then re-register them in the organic scheme. So the question I had for this farmer was that actually, is organics just a label for marketing? Another example I found while I was travelling through Denmark and looking at their seed industry. For those that quickly, the Danes are very big players in the international small seed trade, particularly pasture and vegetable seed. Denmark is like New Zealand. It's low-lying. It's a country made up of 3 islands with a population very similar to ours, and it relies on very shallow groundwater for drinking. And as such, their country is acutely aware of any environmental impacts. There is an increasing awareness among farmers and the industry that glyphosate will one day be deregistered by the EU, and has been done as it has been done in Germany and Denmark. In preparation for this, the industry has begun trialling seed production at scale in a glyphosate-free scenario. The result has been a reduction in saleable seed by around 50%. Now, this result simply comes from contamination of grass weeds that Roundup would have controlled within a normal cropping rotation. So the Danish industry are preparing to move to Eastern Europe where the regulations are not as severe. And there's a real irony in that to the farmers listening, that the majority of the industry in Denmark is all cooperatives. So, the farmers on one hand are losing their industry that they created and most of the value-added side of their arable operations. Mary, on the positive side of that question, I've visited a very large farming operation in the British county of Lincolnshire. It was a very large arable unit growing cereals, brassicas, pulses and processed vegetables. One of their big goals was to lessen their reliance on glyphosate and eventually move to none at all. On this particular property, applications of up to 5 times a year were not uncommon. 3 to 4 in the autumn to kill germinating black grass and other normal broadleaf weeds, and then a pre-harvest application in their cereals, pulses and rapeseed. Now, this is absolutely commonplace in UK and Europe. As I toured this farm and I spoke with the manager, I realised how fortunate we are in New Zealand. Their method for a 90% reduction in glyphosate use within the space of 2 years is simply the addition of sheep, would you believe? The inclusion of pasture and a complete rethink about crop management, beginning with selecting what crops are grown and where, depending on manual evaluation of weed scores. What they discovered that was with a mixed model crop and stock, with the holistic management options that these systems bring, is a very sustainable model compared to what they call the status quo. If the stock are, if you think about that, if the stock are viewed only for their value to the bottom line, they're very hard to justify in the UK. However, when you add the value they bring as a tool for management, they're invaluable. This particular farm have also made a policy decision not to pre-harvest spray crops going forward and a drying and grading harvest at harvest time instead. So Mary, I appreciate the time, and I've got plenty of other examples, but those are 2.
Yeah. So how do you think what you have seen could be applied to New Zealand?
Yeah, well, Mary, the biggest thing for me and farmers in our country to realise, and actually for everywhere really, is that an emphasis on chemical reduction is coming. In October, I travelled to Rome to the UN FAO plenary session. New Zealand is a member state and has signed up to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, or what we call SDGs for short. And these are the backbone for a lot of governments' environmental and sustainability frameworks. Now, New Zealand is no different, and we should be aware that in time we will definitely see a reduction in chemistry availability. We're already seeing it now in the chemicals that the EPA are re-registering. And while glyphosate is a long, long way down that list, there is an emphasis on that going forward. Mary, we're also so far, I think we're so far ahead of the rest of the world on glyphosate, on their glyphosate issue, because of our default land use is outdoor animal agriculture. On my farm and other arable farms, grazing animals they're a very important part of the management of the farm system as a whole. People overseas talk of cover cropping and regenerative agriculture as the future of farming. What a lot of people don't realise is that most farmers in New Zealand have been cover cropping for years and grazing them. We just didn't realise that winter cropping had a label. We just all thought it was good management. The holistic management tool that is the grazing animal is second nature to most farmers, but we shouldn't take it for granted. Compared to a lot of countries, we're very lucky with our climate and our soils. In a lot of countries, these aren't options at all. We need to be very aware, Mary, of the trade-offs in changing systems. And I haven't spoken of facts and figures, but there is one that I'll mention. I spoke with an English economist, Mr. Graham Brooks, who told me that if glyphosate was banned in the United States, The net result would be an increase in fuel burn equivalent to 11 million cars on the road per year. So just think about that, 11 million extra cars. Similarly, our small seed industry in this country would suffer the same fate as what I saw in Denmark. Just two examples. I think we need to be very mindful that glyphosate residues are found in food. And I haven't talked about them because of a time thing, but it is a very real thing. In New Zealand, they can only come from two places in my mind, and that's the pre-harvest spraying of cereal crops and during the pasture renewal process, where it's perfectly acceptable to be grazing or baling after spraying. It is my recommendation that we should avoid both of these practices. Mary, to me, the science is divided on glyphosate, both for and against. Interestingly, the science part of the opposition isn't divided on glyphosate being used, but more the amounts and the frequency. When you compare New Zealand to other developed countries, we apply glyphosate to only 6% of our farmland, which is very, very low. But to me, it's a real wicked problem for agriculture because farmers have to decide whereabouts they position themselves in a problem with no answer. There is no right and wrong, no good or bad. Personally, I don't believe we have a problem in New Zealand, but we must not be afraid to explain what we're doing and why we're doing it, and remind people that farming in New Zealand is mainly a holistic activity with some science added along the way. And I guess to close, I think every farmer needs to be aware about sustainability. Is it sustainable to carry on as we are with a product that on paper is absolutely fine and is the duster on a blackboard? Or I think we need to regard this product with a little more respect and sustain its use into the future in a more specialised manner for the sake of continued production. Our management philosophies must change to consider glyphosate as a tool rather than basing our management around its place inside normal practice.
Well done, Hamish. Well done. Well done to you and to Cam for his presentation. We do have a couple of questions which I'll perhaps take at this stage. The first is from Solus Norton, and I think it really is for both Cameron and Hamish. What are the bits that scare you most about what you studied?
I'd use the word casual ignorance. But, you know, so many people have an opinion about food and farming, but actually are ignorant to actually what goes on farm day to day. And even, you know, I guess broader than that is someone was talking to me in America about tangible benefits. And, you know, we're told that cell phones might give us cancer, but yet everyone holds them up to their head and carries them around on their groin. Ignorance to science. So, a person I was talking to about my topic, can't remember where that was, but we were talking. She was saying to me how you know, you cannot trust science. It's not to be trusted. And I said to this person, well, we all trust science every day. You know, you trusted science, or I trusted science this morning when I washed my hair. You trusted it when you put your makeup on, and we certainly both trusted it when we brush our teeth. You know, it's I guess it's this lack of understanding that's coming forward now that really scares me the most.
A question for Hamish. Hamish, in your report, you mentioned that glyphosate, when it was first developed, had perhaps poor marketing. Is there an issue around the way we market changes in our agricultural science that reflects on the later acceptance of that science? Is there an issue around marketing within agriculture? Perhaps, Cam, you might like to mention it as well.
Yeah, I think there is a problem with marketing, because the things that I found I didn't know, and I've been a glyphosate user for a few years now and hadn't heard about them. So, yeah, I think that there is some work to be done there around getting more of the other side of the glyphosate story out. Yeah, definitely.
Question for Hamish. In a highly urbanised country like New Zealand, should we not move this discussion from an industry level to include household level impact conversation? Putting both rural and urban folks on the same level might help pass legislation and allow faster adoption. Your thoughts?
Well, yeah, are we highly urbanised? That's a question I would say. But yeah, there's no harm. I don't think there's any harm in having that discussion at a wider level. I mean, it was on the radio for all to listen to on that day 2 years ago, and that's what sparked my interest. So yeah, maybe it's a good thing.
The last question, really, Hamish, you talked about glyphosate being a wicked problem, the issues around glyphosate being a wicked problem. Ben, I know, Ben Hancock is talking next week about wicked problems in his report and his presentation. Do you have any sort of additional thoughts or comments about glyphosate as a wicked problem that you would like to finish this presentation with?
Well, I guess, Mary, that glyphosate is just one example of things that farmers do day to day, with the understanding that what we're doing is right, that it's best practice, that it's got science behind it, that it's got years of research behind it, then everything is good. And yet there's the other side of the story that we haven't heard, that, you know, if you look at science as unproven, but there's definitely a story there. So the wicked problem in that is that we take what we're doing on a daily basis with opposition, I suppose, on the other side of it, and then we have to decide what's the right and wrong thing for farmers to do. And I guess there's the way the EPA look at glyphosate is they look at glyphosate under a scientific model, that if something can be proven, then that's how we'll base our decision. Whereas in Europe, they take the precautionary approach to any decisions that they make. And so farmers in other countries are governed a lot on what they can and can't do, where we haven't got that level of governance so much. So we, for all intents and purposes, have to decide for ourselves. So, I mean, the wicked problem for me is that where do farmers pitch themselves in that wicked problem?
So a question's just arrived, which actually might really follows on from what you've just said. Hamish, how do you see the regulatory framework being developed to direct farmers to use Roundup along the lines that you suggest?
Well, in New Zealand, our EPA sits outside of government, and it is a government department in its own right, but it hasn't got a ministry attached to it. So it is not up for any parliamentary pressure or political pressure of any kind. So, as I just said, they take the scientific angle, what can be scientifically proven risk versus benefit, versus the what I was just saying about Europe and other countries that take the precautionary approach. So in this country, I don't think anything's going to change in terms of the glyphosate regulation in the short term. And I think it comes down to the fact that what I was saying before, actually we don't use it a lot in this country anyway. So it's not a big problem compared to a lot of other countries.
Yeah. So with another question or comment has arrived, question and comment. When 99% of chemicals we consume are naturally occurring, do we need to remind consumers that it's the dose that makes something poisonous, not the poison itself?
Yes, that's dead right. And there's a Swiss chemist who in the 1500s came up with the comment, I think it's the dosage that maketh the poison, which is exactly right. And it's exactly the same, you know, table salt and coffee and all those things that we consume on a daily basis are 100 times more toxic than what glyphosate is. So yeah, I agree, Mary. It's the dosage that maketh the poison.
Thank you for answering the questions that have arrived, and thank you to the people who've asked the questions. And now it's my pleasure to hand back to Chris.
Well, thank you all for joining us, and thank you to Hamish and Cameron for your insightful comments. If you've got any further questions that you would like to raise as a result of both Hamish and Cameron's presentations, you're very welcome to forward them to the Rural Leaders team in our email there at programs@ruralleaders.co.nz. But for now, we'd be delighted if you could join us again on Tuesday, the 2nd of June at 11:30, when you'll hear our last 2019 Scholar Ben Hancock, talk about taming wicked problems. Again, can I thank all of our strategic partners, in particular Mackenzie Charitable Foundation, for facilitating today's webinar. Again, finally, thanking Cam and Hamish for their insightful and thought-provoking presentations. If you want to read their full reports, they are posted on the New Zealand Rural Leaders website. And finally, kia ora tātou, ka kite anō. Thank you all, and we'll see you again at 11:30 on the 2nd of June. Ka kite.
Thank you all. Thanks for coming. Thanks, Chris.